is life like when you're born into a family that includes disability? If you are the sibling of a person who has a disability, if you are the sibling anyway, there are always challenges. Add a disability to that equation and it can bring up a whole set of new challenges. Some of those challenges and the stories that people have experienced make up a book that was released some 12 years ago by Kate Strohm. It's called Siblings. It's just about to have another edition released, a revised edition with new and added stories, and it's good to welcome into the studio Kate Strohm, the founder and creator of Siblings Australia and the author of Siblings, Brothers and Sisters of Children with Disability. Kate, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Sonia.
Now, you have a very long history with Siblings Australia. Obviously, it does amazing work in helping people within the families. And I guess that focus or spotlight on disability often means that those around are often in the shadow.
Exactly. I think understandably parents put a lot of energy and money and time into the child with disability. Understandably, service providers do the same. Their focus is on the child with disability, but disability affects the whole family. And I feel very strongly that if we support siblings from a very young age, they're going to remain involved in that relationship maybe a lot longer and be able to add to the social emotional well-being of that person with disability. So it's important to support siblings for their own benefit, but also because they're such an integral part of the family.
Now, Kate, you come from this from a very personal perspective. Just for those who haven't heard your story before, can you explain your situation?
Yes, I had an older sister with cerebral palsy. She died 12 months ago now, but I was 4 years younger than her, and whilst we had a very loving family and I felt very loving and protective towards my sister in many respects, there were a lot of challenges. There was a lot of stress in the family, but also stresses from outside the family. And I think as children, we don't understand things as well, obviously, as we do as adults. And so children can develop fears and anxieties in those sorts of situations. Misinformation, all sorts of things can happen, and it can often be very difficult to talk about those difficult experiences.
And while I'm sure there are a great deal of similarities between people's stories, there must also be, I mean, they're all very unique, aren't they? And so no experience can be mirrored.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we find that siblings' experiences can go right across the spectrum. There are some who take mainly positive things from the experience and can look back and say they were really enriched by that, and they have a very strong relationship with their brother or sister with disability that's lifelong and a very important part of their life. But at the other end, we have siblings who have major mental health problems due to the stresses, due to the different things that they've experienced during their lifetime. And we know that siblings have higher rates of depression, in the middle of that, I guess, of those two extremes, there's a lot of siblings with a bit of both. Just sort of like any sibling relationship, as you say, every sibling relationship is different. And when you add in that extra complexity, then obviously, yes, there's going to be even more variation.
Kate, do you find that experience is often very different even within a family?
Well, it's interesting that you ask that, because at my workshops, a lot of people ask questions related to that. And yes, it can be quite different. For example, I knew a family where there was a child with a genetic issue, Fragile X syndrome, and the older sister accepted him perfectly, and even her friends accepted him. He was a really important part of her life, and vice versa. But the younger sister basically wanted him out of her life. And we have to realise and understand that those two children in that family had a very different experience, being older, being younger.
I find that if you've got 2 or 3 children in a family, a particular event can happen and they all view it completely differently. I have 2 sisters and we can talk about the same event and have a very different view of that. So how more so with a more serious situation like this?
Exactly. And it can be sometimes more difficult for an older child who then has this other child come in and take all of the attention away from parents, but sometimes it can be easier for an older child. They have more nurturing feelings. They've had that child as a baby. And the same with children that are younger. Sometimes it's easier sometimes it's more difficult. It just depends on so many different things, the child's temperament and personality, how they respond to things, but also the people around them, how open the communication is within their family, what sort of messages they get from other people, whether the behaviour of the child with disability is difficult. Some siblings are physically harmed by the child with disability. So there's a lot of factors that influence that outcome.
Kate Strohm is my guest. She's the founder and creator of Siblings Australia. She's also the author of this book, Siblings, which you may well have read in the past. There is a new revised edition of this, and I guess it's important to know, Kate, why you felt it was important that you revised this book of, 12 years ago?
Well, over the last 15 years with Siblings Australia, I've been running workshops for parents and for professionals around Australia and also overseas. And so I felt that I had learnt a lot in that time and had more stories to tell. And so really it was just a case of looking at that original book and thinking, well, no, there is more to be added here. And whilst it's very similar to the original book, it does have more learnings from during that period.
Perhaps a greater complexity about the varied stories
Exactly.
that are around. Now, you may be in a situation like this. Perhaps you have an experience that you would like to add. 1300 222 891. You can also text us on 0467 922 891. Did you grow up in a family that included disability? How did that impact on you and affect you, and how did you work through it? These are some of the issues I guess siblings are dealing with on not only a day-to-day basis, but sometimes an hour-to-hour basis. 1300 222 891. You can also text on 0467 922 891. Kate, how important, you say you were on workshops and that, how important is it for siblings in this case to know, firstly, they're not alone, which I imagine has a great value, but also to learn some of those skills that the workshops teach?
Oh, look, I think peer support programs for children and adults in this situation are incredibly important. You know, these children have to deal with a range of stresses. If you think about just the teasing one, for example, you know, if somebody says to them, you know, oh, your brother's a retard, you must be as well. And, you know, we wish those things didn't happen, but they do. If you or I were to say to a 9-year-old child, well, why don't you say this in response or react this way? It doesn't mean nearly as much as if another 9-year-old says to them, oh, well, I say this when that happens and I do that. The value of peer support is just, you know, hard to measure, really. It's so important.
So these workshops are actually for people living and growing in those situations, not just people looking back and reflecting.
No, ideally, I mean, Siblings Australia hasn't had funding for 6 years, and so we've been really restricted in what we can do. But we've got a program called SibWorks, which is a 6-week peer support program for siblings. And the children who come to that come away feeling empowered, feeling less alone. They often interact more positively with the child with disability. Parents often report it can just be invaluable in them feeling better about themselves, but also about their family situation, knowing that they're not alone. And then with adults, we run internet online forums for adult siblings, and the stories on those can be quite heartbreaking, but the value of sharing that with other siblings can be very, very beneficial for them. And, you know, we would love to be able to do so much more, but again, over the last few years, we've been very restricted.
Have a text here from someone who says, I have 2 daughters with disabilities and it is hard, which I can absolutely imagine. And there's enough guilt in parenting children that don't have disabilities, let alone having the mix. I can imagine, first of all, you'd never feel like you're doing enough for the child with a disability, but also being very aware of the guilt of not giving enough to the other children because you are focusing on the child with a disability. It feels like an impossible situation.
Well, exactly. There's a lot of juggling for parents who do have to put a lot of effort into the child with disability. But the book really talks about ways that parents can support siblings very simply, and the workshops that I run give a lot of really practical suggestions on how parents can support siblings. It doesn't take a lot. It's often what's said to them, how it's said, the sorts of other supports that they can get from other people. Schools, for example, I would love to do more work in schools, and we've got quite a bit of information on our website for schools and what role they can play. But also extended family can be involved, friends. It really is about thinking about the needs of that other child and how they can get that support.
It's 17 minutes past 3 here on 891 ABC Afternoons. Let's go to Seaton. John, good afternoon.
Hello.
John, what did you want to add to this?
I saw an Aussie film about 10 or 12 years ago called The Black Balloon. I can't remember who's in it, but it was about a family who had a son that was disabled, and the negative impact it had upon the brother. I wonder whether your guest has seen The Black Balloon, has got any comments on it.
Kate, are you familiar with the film?
I am indeed, and I actually have met with the director of that film and had a long conversation with her. She actually grew up with two brothers on the autism spectrum. And I think it's a wonderful film for showing the mix of feelings that siblings can have. Very poignant film, very hard to watch for some families, but a wonderful film. It had Toni Collette as the mother and... I can't think of his name, the father who was from Eric Thompson.
Eric Thompson, yeah.
And then a couple of young guys who played the brothers. And yes, it's an excellent film for really understanding the sibling experience.
When people read other people's stories or perhaps go to the workshops, do you find that there is a change in attitude to the way they view their sibling, or perhaps the way, say, parents then treat the sibling who isn't disabled?
I think if a sibling goes to workshops, yes, I think, as I said before, parents often report that the child without the disability accepts their brother or sister a little bit better. They, again, knowing that other children are going through the same thing. Sometimes they hear from other children in the group that, you know, they're dealing with more difficult challenges than they are or whatever. So I think that it can have a big impact. But certainly parents, when I run the workshops, talk about the fact that, yes, they really feel like they've got some tools now to use in their family. And the book covers a lot of those issues as well. And like I said, they're very simple things. You know, I'm aware that when parents come to a workshop like this, they're probably feeling pretty stretched and, you know, I don't want to be thinking about something else. But it really is very important that those children are catered for. I think I remember an email I got from an older sibling a while back, and she grew up with two children in the family with disability, and she had two sisters who didn't have disability. And they were talking together, these three sisters without disability, and realised that at no stage in their lives had anyone ever said to them, "Are you okay? Would you like some support?" And all three of those women have had ongoing depression and you know, issues around that. And I just can't help think that if only we would get in early with those children and support them, make them feel stronger with dealing with the challenges that they might face, then not only are they going to be stronger themselves, but again, as I said earlier, that relationship with the person with disability is going to be stronger. And we put so much money into people with disability, as we should. We put so much money into parents, as we should, but we don't put anything into siblings, and they're dealing often with very much the same stresses as parents.
Are you convinced that if we did get in early and if we did just give a little bit of support, that could make a very big difference in the impact on these siblings?
Definitely.
So it wouldn't actually take a lot, in your view?
No. I think some peer support, some information, some help in the family with how to communicate, all of those things, and for there to be some flags that go up, you know, at school. If this child is a sibling, maybe for the school to understand, well, maybe they won't get their homework done every night. Maybe they'll come to school sometimes and be tired. Maybe their social skills might be a little bit limited because they've just grown up with an older brother with autism, for example. So just thinking about what that child might need. For example, they may not be able to go to football practice because their parent may not be able to take them. So trying to help them maybe take part in community activities. Now, schools can't be all things to all people, so I'm not suggesting that schools take that full responsibility, but as a community we should be thinking about these children and thinking about what their needs are as well as the other people in the family. And
I'm sure that the siblings probably have grown up with this sense of, this idea that, well, I'm the lucky one in a sense, and so they perhaps feel guilty about feeling any of those negative feelings.
Exactly, which is why often they get squashed, which then can lead to those longer-term mental health problems.
And it must be hard for them to understand why they're feeling bad when they feel that perhaps they should be considering themselves the lucky one.
Exactly, and they're often told that. I've had parents who've said to me, well, I tell her all the time she should feel lucky that she doesn't have a disability. So what opportunity does that child in that family have to have the normal grizzles and grumbles that all children have a right to have? And so, yes, the guilt feelings can be very, very strong. The grief feelings can be very, very strong. Grief,
on what you missed out on.
Well, also grief for the child with disability, seeing what they can't do that you can do. A sibling can go off and play basketball or go to parties, and maybe the brother or sister is at home.
So is that quite sort of almost a parallel to survivor guilt, almost, sort of?
Well, I think, yes, that is very much that, why was I not affected by this? Why was it my brother or sister? And some of that is good because it helps people have a really strong appreciation for life, but sometimes that can be, the needs of other people can always be put ahead of their own needs, and that can be a real problem with siblings.
Just an interesting text from Alyssa. She says, I worked in an office with two men who really stood out as being kind and patient. I witnessed the conversation where they discovered that each had a sister with a disability. It was beautiful to hear the way they spoke about their sisters and their relationships. It made their personalities in the workplace all make sense. So, I guess we're focusing now on some of the difficulties and the challenges, but there's a lot of positives to come out of those relationships that I think we see highlighted time and time again.
I think a lot of siblings would say that they learnt perhaps greater compassion and tolerance of difference and an understanding of the important things in life, and certainly can take a range of positive things from the experience. But unfortunately, they're the sorts of stories that we hear all the time because they're the easy stories to tell. We don't hear the more difficult stories, and they're often swept under the carpet because it is hard. And I think siblings often feel very disloyal talking about their own experiences when, again, they feel that they've been lucky in many respects not to have a disability. But there can, as I said, be a range of things that can be difficult, as we mentioned, guilt, but also grief. When I was talking about grief, it's grief for their brother or sister, it's grief for their parents and the stresses that they're going through, but also grief for themselves, that they don't have the brother or sister that other people have. They can't do the things with their brother or sister that others can't. I always wished that I'd had a sister that I could share my children with or go shopping with or do the sorts of things that other sisters could do together. And I think that can sometimes be exacerbated when it's a twin relationship as well, because they see how other twin relationships are. But yes, there can be a range of positive things come from this as well, but we have to at the same time not dismiss the experience and the challenges for siblings, and let the fact that there are certainly some people who have those positive experiences override the fact that there are a lot of children that still need support.
Well, I'm sure that this touches a chord with a lot of people who are in this situation. And so let's talk about the book again. It's called Siblings, Brothers and Sisters of Children with Disability. It has been revised and so is being re-released this year, 12 years after Kate first released it. But there's also Siblings Australia, which people could perhaps get in contact with if you're not aware of it already, and the potential workshops that are there. Kate, thanks very much for shining the spotlight a bit on it for us again today.
Thanks for having me, Sonia.
Kate Strohm, founder and creator of Siblings Australia, and as I said, author of that book.